This is my new favorite sweater that I just bought. Isn't it glorious? Hi everyone, my name is Maddie and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be wrapping up everything that I read in January, which is 9 books. Not bad. I'm trying to be more intentional in my reading this year. I know this is something that a lot of booktubers talk about, but the more you make videos about books, the more you feel like you need to read to make videos about books, and I think it's important to make sure that you're reading for you and not necessarily for everyone else, even though I know I only have 16? Are we at 16 subscribers on this channel? Wow, we're growing like mad. But yes, let's get going. So this video isn't 8 hours long. The very first book that I read was Skim, which is by Mariko Tamaki, I believe, who is a Canadian graphic novel artist, and this book follows a character who is nicknamed Skim at this high school that she goes to in the event of, or I guess, the aftermath of the death of a student by suicide at the school. And her friend are kind of at odds with each other. It's very much like a growing up, coming of age type story. I didn't really like it. I found her and her friend to be like really unlikable people. They were just really awful, and like the ex-girlfriend of the person who took their own life is having a really difficult time with it because like obviously she went through a breakup and then she went through losing this person, and they're just like jerks, absolute jerks to her. They just say the worst stuff and they assume that she's doing it for attention, and it's really difficult to me because I know Skim goes kind of on this journey of understanding herself better and like learning to not put her negative energy out into the world basically, but it feels very, it's not the best exploration of teenage suicide in a book at all, and it's not dealt with in the most sensitive way because we're seeing it through their lens, and for that reason it is probably a book that I would not return to. I know a lot of people like really highly recommend it, but not for me, not my cup of tea. After that I read All My Colors, which is by David Quantick, who is also the Emmy Award-winning writer of Veep, which is a TV show I believe with Tina Fey. So this book follows the character Todd Milstead, who is a wannabe writer, a serial adulterer, and basically a misogynist. He's a jerk. If you want to like the main character, don't read this book. But I also think it's very hard to do a book with an unlikable main character well, which is something that this book does. So essentially Todd has this ability to like basically remember anything, so he's always like actively quoting stuff back at people almost to like show off a little bit at parties. And then one day he starts quoting this book called All My Colors, and no one knows about it, and he can't find the book and it doesn't exist. And then one day he decides to sit down and write the novel, and he's going to publish it and make money off of it. And of course things go a little haywire. I expected things to go a little more haywire than they end up going, but I think it's a very interesting exploration of the way that the things that we put into the world are a representation of ourselves, and the book kind of explores who Todd is and how his decision to take this work from somebody else ends up becoming a representation of the negative things in his life, and the way that that kind of crops up in other ways as the book starts getting put out into the world is really interesting. Obviously, the main character is a jerk. There is some homophobic language used throughout the book just as a warning, and he's a bit of a misogynist jerk to women, so you gotta be a little bit prepared for that too, just to give you a heads up. After this, I read the first 2 volumes of Finding Home, which is a webcomic series that I am now obsessed with. Pretty much what this series explores is it follows Chepe and Yannick, who are 2 people. Yannick is a chef, and Chepe is I guess he's like a researcher kind of working for a university, but essentially what happens is their paths cross, and Chepe decides to travel with Yannick as they're trying to get him back home. He's kind of like, oh, I'm going that way, I'll drop you off on the way by because I know this area well. But the big thing is that Chepe is half nymph, so his hair is made of vines, and one of my favorite things about it is he grows flowers in his hair or different plants from his hair, and each of them represent different emotions. The like attention to detail throughout this is stunning, absolutely wonderful, and it is also a slow burn romance as the story goes on. I don't want to get into it too much more because it is going to be my video for my webcomic Wednesday this week, so I will hopefully come back to this and add a card for that. But if you want to hear more about it, be sure to keep your eye out for that video. I will just give some content warnings just so you know ahead of time. There is anxiety addressed in it, alcohol abuse, and past exploration of an abusive relationship that includes some coercion or dubious consent. So if those aren't things you're comfortable reading about, just be wary of it. To give you a heads up though, it is usually, there's a content warning for it before that content comes up, so you can kind of skip over those parts if that's not something you're comfortable reading. After this, I read Twelfth Night by Shakespeare, William Shakespeare. This was for my cross-dressing and literature class, which is pretty interesting that I'm enjoying so far. And I know people who read Twelfth Night in high school because I think it was grade 10. It was either you did Romeo and Juliet or Twelfth Night, and I did Romeo and Juliet, which I don't know why people treat that like Shakespeare's greatest play. It's not. And I don't remember people talking about Twelfth Night as much because there's nothing straight about the ending of this play whatsoever, and I'm just surprised I didn't hear more people discussing it. It's really interesting to look back at it with a like 21st century understanding of gender and sexuality and gender expression and all of that. For those of you who don't know, the play basically follows Viola, and after her and her brother Sebastian are in a shipwreck, and basically Viola decides that she's going to dress up as a man so that she can get into this court for the time being. She ends up working with this duke who is in love with someone named Olivia. So what essentially ensues is a love triangle where the duke is in love with Olivia, Olivia is falling in love with Viola, who is presenting as a man in male clothing because Olivia presumes that that's a man, and then Viola is in love with the duke, but she can't tell the duke because he doesn't know that she is a woman. I really enjoyed it. I wasn't really expecting to. I don't mind reading Shakespeare. I know a lot of people hate it, but I do think there is some really beautiful writing, and I don't want to say he was like ahead of his time because that sounds so dramatic and pretentious, but I do think there's a lot of subtle nuances where he was very aware of what was going on and the ways that he could push the boundaries, and he really takes some of those liberties, which is really interesting to go back at and reread and analyze and wonder what he was thinking about at the time. After that, I read the book Jonny Appleseed, which is one of the Canada Reads picks. I'm thinking that I'll probably do a series closer to the Canada Reads competition where I do a review of all the books if I can get them all read by them. For those of you who don't know, Canada Reads is a Canadian competition where basically they try and pick a book that all Canadians should read based on a particular topic. I think this year the topic might be escape or something like that, kind of to go with the pandemic. But they have Canadian celebrities all defend the books, and then it's kind of this big book debate. It's one book gets knocked off each day of the week until there's one book left standing at the end. So Jonny Appleseed follows this character, Jonny, who is a two-spirit Indigenous person, and he has moved to Winnipeg from his reserve, and he's working as a cyber sex worker as a way to make money. It's very interesting to me in some ways. The book is very sexually explicit at points, and I think I struggled with reading it because that's not something that I would willingly go out of my way to read in general. It's just not something that I'm super comfortable or interested in reading about. And I was trying to figure out what in the book was writing style that I didn't like or narrative that I didn't really like, and what was my own uncomfortability with the topic to make sure I wasn't projecting that onto the writing. There are some particular dream sequences or word choice around the descriptions of things that I didn't really like. There was a term white ectoplasm at one point. I'll let you guess what that refers to, but I wasn't really a fan of that. So yeah. But I do think that the book does an interesting job at looking at some of the vulnerabilities of people in sex work, or some of the more realistic explorations of what it's like to work in that industry, as well as there is a very honest portrayal of some of the fetishization in some ways of people of color, and the way that some people like request him to dress up as this like real Indian with like the headdress and everything like that, and he has to lean into it a little bit in order to make more money because people don't have an authentic idea of what an actual Indigenous person looks like. It's a very raw portrayal of kind of some of the struggles and difficulties that Indigenous people, but particularly queer Indigenous people, go through. I wouldn't say it was necessarily my favorite book because I think it lost me in some of those moments with those a little bit maybe too broad descriptions of things for my own liking, but Jonny was enough of a likable character to be able to pull me through the story. So I'm gonna leave that one there for now. If I do a full analysis, I'll come back and link it. After this, I read The Butterfly Garden, which is by Dot Hutchinson, and I think this is my favorite book that I read this month, probably after the Finding Home series. So this book follows FBI agents Victor Hanoverin and Brandon Edison as they're trying to put together the pieces of basically this massive mystery that they've uncovered. So essentially there's this house with this gardener who kidnaps young women and tattoos massive butterflies onto their back, and they're basically called the butterflies, and he is called the gardener, and they have just basically apprehended him and gone into this house and set all the women free, and they are interviewing Maya, who is one of the girls who was trapped inside. So the book is told between the interviews with them and then Maya's telling of the story as kind of flashbacks to what was going on. Of course, there is just some trigger content warnings for kidnapping, sexual abuse, rape, physical abuse, and I guess child and family neglect as well are just all things to be aware of because it is a very heavy book. That being said, it is one of the best thrillers I think I have read in a really long time. The situation that they kind of develop in this world of the butterflies and the garden is incredibly unsettling, but also incredibly well done in the research that Dot Hutchinson has put into it in order to make it a really honest portrayal, and she doesn't shy away from some of that, from some of the trauma and the way that looking at how a human brain would adapt to that situation, and looking at the vulnerabilities that put women in those places, and the way that people kind of rationalize or learn to compartmentalize things. It was a really well written book, and sometimes I was reading it and I didn't think it could get more messed up, and then it did. It's the first book in a series of 4. I don't know if the characters continue or if it's just the detectives themselves that continue through the books. Either way, I'll be sure to check out some of her other writings because I really enjoyed this book a lot, and I definitely think it deserves a lot more recommendations. After that, I read Finding Home 3, which is just the fact that I had read, there's 3 chapters in each volume of Finding Home, and I hadn't been able to finish the 9th chapter because all the pages weren't out. But then I joined the Patreon, which I encourage you to join Patreons of artists to support them if you can, because it really means a lot. So I was able to have a chance to go through all of those pages and finish that book up. Still 5 stars, recommend. Take the time to check it out. The very last book that I read this month is called Boo by Neil Smith, and I have some thoughts about it. So the book follows Oliver, who is nicknamed Boo because he's so pale, when he wakes up in heaven, and essentially it's this heaven for 13-year-olds from America specifically. This is this world that they're trapped in that is ruled by Zig, which is kind of what they call their god figure. He does a very good job in the book at trying to keep it relatively agnostic, that's the word for no religion, I believe, so that it's not specific to one particular religious experience. And shortly after arriving, he discovers that he's a Gomer, which is a kid who has been murdered, and one of his other classmates shows up and reveals that they were both killed in a school shooting by this gun boy, and they're trying to unravel what happens. So right off the bat, I do want to give content warnings for topics of school shootings, as well as suicide, discussions of mental illness, and there's also an explicit reenactment of a lynching at one point, so just be wary of that. I think that's where I struggled a bit with this book. In the first half, the description of mental illness wasn't dealt with very well, and I wasn't really sure where it was going. There's kind of these like asylums that they put their sad cons in, this kids who are sad and confused, which I didn't really appreciate or was over the moon with. It also takes place at the end of the 1970s, I think it's 79 into 80 and beyond, and because of that, some of the language they use isn't very great. The R slur and the F slur are both used, the R slur more repeatedly, and I think I find that really difficult when like a book like this that's published in 2016 is using that kind of language. I never know where the line is between authenticity and essentially using the past as a way to get away with this inappropriate language. I don't think that we should like gloss over it in any way or like make this rose-colored idea of what the past was, but I also just worry about the perpetuation of that language in ways that it doesn't really need to be continued, or those conversations could be had in maybe other ways that don't necessarily need to lean on those slurs. That being said, I think the second half of the book is a lot stronger, and the messages that come across at the end are actually quite beautiful and quite well done if you can get through kind of the slow chug of the first half of the book. It's definitely unique, and it takes a very nuanced approach to some things. It just takes a while to get there. So that's everything I read this month. I don't know when I'm going to start reading for February. I think I have 4 or 5 books on the go right now for class, so we'll see how many of them end up getting finished up this month on top of everything else that I'm reading. If you have any recommendations, as always, leave them down below. If you've read any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, you can follow my Goodreads and Instagram in the description down below, and feel free to subscribe and ring that bell so you get notifications when I have new videos coming out. Otherwise, I will see you all on Wednesday for the next installation of Webcomic Wednesdays.